Hello and welcome to Laughing Through the Pain, Navigating Wellness with me, Richard L. Blake, aka The Breath Geek, my co-host Andy E. Sam, and today we have got a good friend of mine, a fellow breath worker named James Dowler, aka Breathe with James. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Rich. Really, really good to be here.
Good. We are glad to have you. How are you doing, Andy?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm feeling quite intimidated, to be honest. I'm intimidated and excited. I'm aware that I'm sitting with two of the most capable minds in the breathing space in the world today, perhaps. So I'm excited to learn and also slightly intimidated. But yeah, excited.
Well, no need to be intimidated. You are here representing the everyman, the people who
everyman.
aren't breathwork
What did you
practitioners.
say?
So
What's the
yeah,
antidote
you're
to
here.
knowledge or something? The antithesis to
The
being
wellness,
informed.
the wellness wanderer. I
The
think.
wellness wanderer. Yeah, that's what I'm
I
going
think
for.
that's yeah. That's a work. We're workshopping that name, but yeah. Anyway, so James and I met on Alan Dolan's breathwork training. He's known as the Breath Guru, and he taught us conscious connected breathing. Conscious connected breathing is a type of breath work that puts people into non-ordinary states of consciousness. It stems from the holotropic school of breath work, and it's the kind of one that's very akin to psychedelics. And that's the one I've done my PhD research in. James has sort of veered away a little bit from that type of breath work, and now he does things that are more focused on regulating the nervous system. So, James, tell us a little bit more about your work and why you chose to take that path.
Yeah, so as you say, we met on Alan Dolan's training a few years ago, and the first, I guess, couple of years of me teaching breathwork were oriented around that specific style in conscious connected breathing and using the breath to process and clear what one might refer to as emotional charge or trauma from the body. I guess on a purely personal level, the reason why I decided to shift away from that style of breathwork was first and foremost because I stopped practicing it. And so it felt like it would be out of integrity to keep on sharing a practice that I wasn't personally practicing. The reason why I stopped practicing it was I stopped finding benefit from it. And I think in hindsight, doubt the extent to which I even benefited from it at all, even during training to become a practitioner in it. The reason why I was so attracted to it as a modality was that I felt it was a relative shortcut in relation to being able to process and clear my emotional charge and move into a more, I guess, emotionally stable place. I really liked the idea of going off on a few retreats, going to a few workshops and having these big cathartic experiences that would bring up all of my stuff and move me into a more, emotionally stable place. I think for me personally, in hindsight, what I have come to found that I needed was a more gentle, nervous system informed approach, which worked on a level of regulating my nervous system and moving into a more settled and regulated state, rather than doing the sort of deep dive work trying to bring up and clear whatever is being stored within my emotional body.
Nice. And so, is there a type of person or a type of ailment you think your kind of breath work is more suited for?
So I guess the style of breathwork that I teach at the moment is oriented around nervous system downregulation. So that's anyone who might be in what we might refer to, or as at least in the nervous system world, in a state of sympathetic hyperarousal. Something that I found really helpful since doing Alan's training is becoming a little bit more what I refer to now as like nervous system informed. So I really like the work of Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. And sympathetic hyperarousal, as laid out by Stephen Porges in sort of simple everyday man terms, would be effectively being in a slightly stressed and anxious state. So we live in what we could refer to as quite a sympathetic dominant culture in which we live busy, frenetic, stressful lives. And downregulating breathwork can effectively be really helpful to move one out of a state of sympathetic hyperarousal back into what Stephen Porges would refer to as ventral regulation, which effectively means just a nervous system that's slightly more settled, slightly more balanced, and slightly more regulated. And that's what I guess I personally found what I needed, and what also, I guess, the type of people who are attracted to the style of breathwork that I now teach tend to need in relation to that down regulation and moving into a more settled and still place effectively.
James, one thing that I think kept coming up in the research that I was sort of doing on you and doing around your topic was anxiety. And I know that at the start of COVID, quite early on, the Evening Standard posted something about you doing a live breath work to deal with what I think they called cove anxiety. A common thread that I've seen I know Rich is obviously doing a massive study in how conscious connected breathing can affects anxiety. And I think the common theme that I was reading for the Evening Standard is, how it affects anxiety without actually any focus on, is that the main point of it? And is that kind of, when you talk about a sort of settled, more rested nervous system, is that the opposite of being anxious?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess first and foremost, it depends how one defines anxiety. Anxiety could be a label for a wide range of symptoms that one's experiencing, whether that's in the form of feeling or sensation in one's body. I guess broadly speaking, and in simple terms, the way that I would put anxiety into a framework of polyvagal theory is anxiety effectively equals a nervous system state that's slightly overly mobilized or overly aroused. And that's when something like down-regulating breath work can be quite helpful to dissipate that sympathetic hyperarousal and move one back into a more settled and still place and return to this place of ventral regulation. I guess when you ask the question, is that the point of breath work, and is that where breath work is helpful? That's when you sort of open up this bigger question in relation to what is breath work, and what are the different styles and modalities that one might use, dependent upon what their aim is. So if someone is in a slightly anxious state, if someone is in a nervous system state but is slightly overly aroused, then there might be a specific style of breath work, like down regulating breath work, you would use to move back into a more settled and relaxed place. But there are lots of different styles of breath work, like conscious connected breathing that Rich is doing his PhD on, that wouldn't necessarily be, in my opinion, the most appropriate style of breath work to practice if someone was in a state of sympathetic hyperarousal. But if you were looking to do deep therapeutic work and process and clear emotional charge or trauma from the body, then it could be quite a helpful modality of breath work to engage in. Rich and I probably have potentially slightly differing views in relation to the styles of breath work one might use and when. And I guess that speaks to the nuance of the practice. And also, I guess the more versed one becomes in breath work, and the more attuned one comes to their specific emotional and physiological state, how one might be able to apply specific modalities of breath work to them and what they need, rather than breath work just being this sort of blanket practice that everyone and anyone practices, regardless of the emotional and physiological state that they find themselves in.
Yeah, different drinks for different needs applies to breath work as well. And James, you said something earlier about everyone has anxiety, or it may not have been picked up on the recording because we had a little bit of technical difficulties, listener. Sorry about that. But this is something that I've found from my PhD study. So I tried to recruit people with anxiety. I said, do you have anxiety? If so, join my breathwork study. I had close to 300 people apply, and I would say only 10% of people had even mild anxiety. Everyone else, 90% of people who thought they had anxiety, had normal levels of anxiety. This is based on the Zung Self-Rating Anxiety Scale. It's a very well regulated or validated study. So it's not the test. It has a Cronbach's alpha that's very high, which means it tests what it's supposed to test. I actually had to change my study to be like, I haven't got enough people with anxiety. There aren't enough people in anxiety who want free breath work. So I had to lower the scores down. Like 45 was the level for people with mild anxiety. And I had to lower it down to 35 to get enough people into the study. And what I think this shows is, this is, one of the reasons we want this podcast out there is because of the problems in the breathwork industry. I think not just the breathwork industry, the whole wellness industry, we're telling people they have problems when they don't have problems, so that we can make money, feel useful, and get clients effectively.
But presumably, I mean, there is a common thread. I mean, you started your PhD looking at anxiety, presumably for a reason. In the same way, the London Evening Standard reached out to James and to see if he could help people who had COVID anxiety using breathwork. So presumably there is something there that pushes people towards the curiosity with the link with breathwork and anxiety.
Well, yeah, sure, there are people with anxiety out there, and me being one of them, or previously I was one of them. But I think a lot of people maybe have some kind of like psychological hypochondria. And if you tell someone they're sick because, you publish an article, they're going to start to think they're sick. And then they're going to find reasons to believe they're sick when they're not, when actually they're just experiencing life. Life is difficult. There are times you should be anxious. There are times where anxiety helps you to function. It focuses your thoughts. It helps you avoid disasters, run away from lions, think sharply when you're in an argument. Anxiety is a good thing. It's just chronic high levels of anxiety are a problem.
So where do you see the I guess mental health epidemic sitting within that, and the epidemic in relation to the amount of medication or psychological medication that's prescribed to people? Were there things that came up in your study that did over-indicate in relation to people scoring very high in psychological symptoms that weren't anxiety?
I only tested for anxiety, yeah.
Okay.
But definitely there are a lot of other people in there with other things, addiction, trauma, depression, things like that. I think part of the problem is, the statistics are probably, there's a lot of people who think they have anxiety when they're just struggles with living. It's not a pathology. It's just life is tough.
What I'm trying to get to is, why did you start with anxiety in the first place?
Because I had anxiety, basically.
Okay.
And how would you label anxiety?
Not able to sleep, not able to function, doing compulsive things like pulling out my eyebrows, binge eating, not being able to go out, not being able to go to social functions, sweating. There's a lot of different manifestations of anxiety.
Because I think it potentially comes back to what I was maybe badly trying to say earlier in relation to everyone well, maybe you've just disproven this, but this idea that this question in relation to what is anxiety. So it feels like there could be that could just be any form of emotional dysregulation, or does anxiety differ from another psychological pathology?
You can be anxious and depressed at the same time, or you can be just anxious or just depressed. And yeah, there are a lot of different ways that anxiety can come up. And I think, I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but, we talk about the medical industrial complex, and a lot of people have a big problem with the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for mental health. Every year, or every 10 years or so, when that gets redone, they're putting new things in there so that they can pathologize, so that they can medicate other things. And yes, there's probably people who are, we have more anxious people than in the past, but maybe that's just because one, they're being told there's a way out that involves you can just take medication, and instead of just regulating their nervous system in a normal way. And nervous system dysregulation, I think is normal. Everyone gets emotionally dysregulated at times. It's not necessarily a pathology. People just come back. They have their ways. They they pet their dog. They get a hug from their kids. It doesn't mean that they're sick.
Sure. But would you not say that there are chronic levels of emotional dysregulation that are unprecedented in the Western world today?
I don't know if that's any different from in the past. I think a big part of it is just people are more aware of anxiety. I don't think necessarily we are more unhappy than we used to be. It's just now, in the past, you just be like, oh yeah, life is rubbish. Now it's like, oh no, life's not rubbish. I'm sick.
But I could know the statistics off by heart, but like, for example, like the ever increasing rates of male suicide and I guess I can't prove it, but there's something within me that suggests that we are, even if more sort of like potentially emotionally intelligent than we've ever been, or at least aware of these different diagnostics and pathologies, more emotionally dysregulated than we've ever been.
Possibly. I think it's probably both, in that there are a lot of people who, excuse me, there are a lot more people who are sick, and there are a lot more people who think they're sick when they're not. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, James. I saw quite an interesting. I've got this. It's probably my problem, but I suspect it's a wider problem, which is trying to pick through, get the wheat from the chaff, if you like, in the wellness industry, and who to trust, who not to trust. And I get tons of targeted ads, and it's very hard to pick my way through which are authentic and who's just trying to sell you something. So I think you put a post about essentially that there are quite a few people trying to fast track to become a breath worker. And I know as a consumer, I have been to Alan Dolan and I've had a one-on-one session with him. I found it incredibly powerful, both physically and emotionally. And it's reassuring to me that, you know, your opinion is that you can't become a breath worker in a weekend or whatever, because I would absolutely want to feel protected and supervised in what is quite a kind of vulnerable state during breath work. So I just wondered if you could sort of highlight to people best place to start, in your opinion, in kind of finding the truth in this practice. And I recognize there are different types of breath work, but could you perhaps signpost a few of the ones that you think are kind of authentic, and what to look out for if you're not sure where to start your journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. It definitely feels like it's a little bit of a wild west out there. I think with the sort of rise of social media and people's increasing awareness that you can make quite a lot of money off training people in a relatively short period of time, there's a lot of people jumping on that, and there is a real danger in it, specifically in relation to the styles of breath work that are more intense and work more on a deep emotional and therapeutic level, because you are working with other people's stuff, and potentially with other people who are in quite a vulnerable and fragile state. Rich and I speak quite a lot to this. If you compare it to a psychotherapy training, specifically, say we're specifically talking about the modalities of breathwork within that realm of emotional release or working on that deep emotional therapeutic level. Psychotherapy trainings are sort of 5-6 years, whereas you can go and find breathwork trainings that are a weekend, and then people are let out into the world as inverted commas qualified breathwork practitioners, and are not only working with people on this deep emotional level, but also guiding them through altered states of consciousness, and that is super dangerous. And I have quite increasing numbers of people I come across who have been on the receiving end of this and had not great experiences, and either at least will never go back into a deeper, more therapeutic breathwork session again, but others who have also been emotionally scarred and need to do some sort of therapeutic practice to actually mend the damage that was done. And so it is a little bit of a wild west. And for me, I'd be interested to hear what Richard's opinion is on this, but if one is looking to sort of train in the sort of, deeper, more therapeutic styles of breathwork, really you want to be engaging in trainings that are as long as possible. So really, if possible, any training, in my opinion, that's at least sort of at least coming up to 12 months in length would be ideal. Or maybe not ideal, but would be more appropriate than definitely the ones that are a weekend long. The one that Rich and I initially did was 6 months, which for me in hindsight, I don't think personally was long, or definitely not detailed enough in relation to its training. But there are more trainings coming up out there now that are a bit more in depth and maybe have a bit more integrity to them.
Yeah. I do want to say that, so I'm volunteering for the Global Breathwork Practitioners Alliance now, and they are a body who are trying to regulate the breathwork industry. And to be a GPBA certified school, you need a 2-year training. Some people within the actual organization think that's too long, and maybe a year would be better. But yeah, in Breath Guru's defense, I must defend them because my wife works for them. They are in the process of lengthening their training to get it into the GBPA, and also, I think James and I were maybe the second ever cohort. They've now done, dozens and dozens of other cohorts, and the breathwork training has improved a heck of a lot. Partly due to Natalia, of course, and of course, Alan's always growing and improving there. But yeah, the breathwork industry definitely needs regulation. Another reason we want this podcast to be out there is because we do want, one, to protect vulnerable individuals who don't understand that, someone may say, oh, I teach breathwork, and maybe they've never even had a training, and I have been to a breathwork session where a guy went to something called quantum life breathing. He was running a yoga retreat, and then he said, I'm going to do this quantum life breathing for everyone on my retreat, including me. And it was basically holotropic breathwork, and there were people like freaking out. People had to leave. Everyone went into tetany. And this was before I was a breathwork trainer. I was just like, oh my God, what is this? And of course, there are just so many people in the wellness industry who have absolutely zero integrity, zero ethics, and they're not going to pay for a training. They're just going to call themselves a breathworker and then harm a load of people. It makes me very angry.
Yeah.
The other thing we want to do this podcast for is to get practitioners to up their game, because if we don't do this ourselves, someone's going to do it for us. Someone is going to shut us down. Someone is going to come and regulate us, and it's going to ruin the industry. And I do have concerns that the industry is going to buckle under its own malpractice.
I suppose then, I mean, I've said how powerful I found the physical and emotional state, and I think, having done it a handful of times, to steal words from James's Instagram, he said that you should do it. So you shouldn't do it with someone without the relevant therapeutic training, and I think that is obviously applicable to so many areas of wellness. But I suppose it'd be nice to hear from you, you both. But we'll start with James. What is actually happening to you when you're doing breath work? Because I've done it multiple times. I still don't really know. And I think it'd be really helpful to sort of touch on why is it you get such a huge emotional and physical reaction.
You want to answer on that, James, and I'll say a bit about conscious connected breathwork?
Yeah, it's a good idea. I think it's a good point. So
Yeah.
I guess the style of breathwork that I teach, so which maybe let's label as moving one into a more relaxed and settled place, broadly in simple terms.
Mm-hmm.
What's basically happening when one uses the breath in that way is you're using your breath to send a cue of safety to your brain. So inside your brain is something called your insular cortex, which is constantly effectively scanning your body for signals, and specifically watching your breath for changes in its cadence and for changes in its rhythm. When you slow your breath down, your brain perceives that as there being no immediate threat in either your external or internal environment, and in doing so begins to bring something called the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system online. The parasympathetic branch of your nervous system is otherwise known as the slowing down branch of your nervous system, and is the branch of your nervous system that needs to have a certain amount of activity and strength to it for you to feel relaxed and settled. Within a slightly more complex model of nervous system regulation, within the parasympathetic nervous system is something called your ventral vagus, and that is specifically the branch of your nervous system within the parasympathetic that comes online when you engage in things like slow conscious breathing, down regulating breath work, and moving the systems in your body into a more relaxed and settled place. So you're effectively using your breath to create a shift in what we might refer to as your neurobiology, which is your nervous system and brain.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so conscious connected breathwork is, as I said earlier, it's I would say more powerful in some respects, not necessarily more useful, but you would certainly experience different changes in your consciousness. They put people in MRIs and seen, big changes in people's brainwaves akin to a moderate dose of psychedelics. The reason that people also get really large emotional discharges is supposedly because of this theory from Reinwein and Williams from a paper in 2009, and they came up with this term called transient hypofrontality. And what that means is because blood gases change with this voluntary hyperventilation, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the front of our brain, that's kind of the part of our brain that evolved the most recently and is part of our sort of executive function and planning and things like that, it gets less oxygen, so it gets down regulated. And one of the jobs of the prefrontal cortex is to protect us from pain, and that includes emotional pain. And so when that part of the brain is no longer protecting us, we can then go and access the emotions that we'd been suppressing, the emotions that we didn't process first time around. So it's kind of like a beach ball, that's been held underwater. It bursts up out of the water and comes up for processing, and people have big cathartic releases, tears, that kind of thing. And as well, people get a lot of mystical experiences. There's one big study from Pressman where they had 13,000 people over 13 years doing outpatient breath work, and they found that about 80% of people, after several sessions, had a mystical experience. And you might ask, what is a mystical experience? So it's a change in consciousness. Some people experience things like they see colors, they contact God, they see ancestors, they have conversations with past loved ones, they go off into other realms, they see other types of beings, little elf people or insect people, and very akin to things that happen on psychedelics and ayahuasca and psilocybin type things. And similarly, psychedelics and ayahuasca get a lot of press these days, because rightly so, because they're getting a lot of really good results, way better results for things like treatment-resistant depression than anything else we've ever had. And what we're finding with breathwork is breathwork's also getting some of these similar results. They're also getting the reductions in anxiety, depression, trauma. And in my study, so my study went really, really well. I'm very excited. It's not been published yet. I'm still running through the data. We found that, we've got statistical significance with p-values of 0.001, so that's really high. We also have really large effect size, which is again really, really good. That's one thing they don't normally tell you in studies. They'll normally say, oh yeah, this antidepressant works better than a placebo, but it worked by like 1% better. And then they say, that's significant, but it's only statistical significance, and statistical significance is only related to the number of people in the study. So we've got both statistical significance and a large effect size. So it's hugely potent for anxiety. And coming back to James's point, there were people that it didn't work for. Just in the same with every single study, there are people who respond to things and there are people who don't respond to things. So the average or the mean reduction in anxiety symptoms was about 35% in my study, compared to the placebo control group, who had a mean reduction of 5%. That doesn't mean everyone got 35%. Some people got zero changes. Some people actually left the study because they found that one person said it made their anxiety worse. They did 5 sessions and they said it made their anxiety worse. So there are definitely people who don't do well from it. That's 1 in 100 people. 1 in 100 people said, this made my anxiety worse. One other person said, I don't like doing breathwork online. This was the first ever study done online. And this person said, I don't feel safe doing it online. I'm going to go find in-person breathwork. So for sure, to James's point, there are people who would be better off doing James's type of breathwork.
Interestingly, I actually share that viewpoint in the couple of sessions I've done online. I'm thinking over COVID, because of the effects it can have on you. And I suppose your own insecurity as someone starting out doing breath work, you're worried about doing it wrong and therefore kind of having a bad experience. So actually, I really like the supervision and comfort of having experts around me, which actually leads me to my next question I was going to ask you, James, is, it would be amazing if everyone could access these huge benefits, and kudos to you for doing that over COVID and putting yourself out there and helping, no doubt, hundreds of people. But if people don't have access to people like you, or, basically, I'm supposing I'd like the barrier for entry to be low, but is this the sort of thing people can work into their daily routine? If so, how do you do that, and what are the best sort of sources to start with, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it again comes back to the style of breathwork that one wants to practice and integrate into every day. I would say, in relation personally, the style of breathwork that Rich was speaking to in relation to conscious connected breathing, and I'd be interested to hear what his views are on this. But I do think that is probably best practiced with the supervision, at least at first, of someone with a relevant therapeutic training in that field. That said, the more gentle, the more calming, the less intense styles of breathwork can definitely be practiced as and when in one's own space and in their everyday. I do think that it can be really nice and can be really supportive to help integrate it into one's everyday life if they use things like guided practices, or have a practitioner they particularly resonate with that has things like an online studio, or I released an app at the end of last year. But the wonderful thing about the breath is that it is available any place, anytime, and for completely free. And that might be as simple as taking a few slow conscious breaths before one goes into a meeting, or elongating one's exhale before one has to give a big presentation, or a whole host of different techniques we can use to downregulate the nervous system and move into a more relaxed and settled place, as and when one needs it. I think that is the real beauty of the breath. It doesn't require some form of external intervention. It's not expensive, and one can use it whenever and wherever they need.
Yeah. One other thing that came out of my study was I used a covariate. So I gave people a 10-minute recording of me guiding them through a 10-minute conscious connected breathing session, and they were encouraged to do that every single day. And at the end of the study, we asked them, how frequently did you use that that breath work recording? And we actually found no differences between the people who did it 0 times and the people who did it every single day. So the conclusion there might be that, conscious connected breathing is great when you do it in a group with a live facilitator, but it's not necessarily effective doing it on a recording where you don't have someone checking in on you, checking your technique, checking you are okay. And maybe 10 minutes is not enough of conscious connected breathing to get effects. And another thing I would say, I guess that kind of favors me as a breath worker, as someone who will eventually start seeing clients once I finish my PhD. I will be able to say, you do need me, actually. You can't just have a free recording. But that is another big problem in the breathwork industry. And I imagine, James, this is one of the reasons you didn't like conscious connected breathing, is you can go to big breathwork workshops where there's 40 participants and one facilitator, and it's just nowhere near enough support and supervision. And similarly with online breath work, you could find people who are doing Zoom sessions with 50 people and it's just them. We had my wife, Natalia, a fellow breath worker there assisting me. So when people did have difficult moments, we could take them off into a breakout room. But yeah, this is another problem in the breathwork industry, is people just are greedy. They want more money for themselves, so they don't hire enough support. What do you think about that, James?
Completely. And I think also naive, and I think lazy too. I've definitely seen I haven't been in sort of big conscious breathing workshops in quite a while, but definitely was in a few earlier on in my conscious connected breathing breathwork career, where I saw some pretty crazy things in terms of people not having great experiences and there not being enough facilitators on hand to support and provide a safe space effectively. I think it's dangerous, pretty dangerous. So it's great to hear that there are at least a few people out there doing good things and providing the safe and supportive spaces you are, Rich.
Yes, I'm the best. Thanks. I appreciate it. Okay, James. I know you've been looking out into the breathwork world. You and I talk about some malpractice out there. So I want to ask you, who's the worst breath worker?
Who's the breath?
If
Well,
we were being kinder to you, we could also say who's the best breath worker. If you couldn't have yourself or Rich,
I'm not.
it might be kinder to signpost some good ones rather than the worst ones.
There's this woman called Natalia who's not great.
The breath streaker. No, she's the best. She's number one. No, you don't have to answer that. But other things in the breathwork industry that you've come across that you don't like. So yesterday, I sent you an Instagram video of a breath worker, and she was encouraging people to do big hyperventilation standing up. And it is very possible to pass out when you're doing voluntary hyperventilation. And this person had about 50,000 Instagram followers, and she's telling 50,000 people to do voluntary hyperventilation standing up. So this is the kind of stuff that drives me mental. What about you, James?
Yeah, I agree. It's mental and crazy. And I don't know, I'd be interested to know what her training was, and also what the logic was behind doing it standing up in the first place. But again, I think it's that sort of thing in relation to having a big Instagram following and wanting to share something that maybe looks different, or I don't know, provides some form of differentiation in relation to her social media account or her Instagram page, but is completely misaligned in relation to being supportive as a therapeutic practice. The other thing, I don't know if you saw, Rich, but the other thing that springs to mind in relation to hyperventilation being used in inappropriate ways was I don't know if Aubrey Marcus or Jake Paul posted it, but it was basically Aubrey Marcus guiding Jake Paul through rounds of hyperventilation before he went into his boxing match. And
I think I saw that.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Which looks, maybe for someone who has no idea in relation to sort of like the biochemistry of the breath and how one would breathe to improve athletic performance, maybe it has this appeal to it of like it being quite intense, it being quite powerful, two relatively like big, strong dudes doing this really powerful breath work before Jake Paul gets in the boxing ring. But from a athletic performance point of view, is a completely inappropriate style of breath work to be practicing, because you're effectively, by blowing off a lot of carbon dioxide, decreasing oxygen delivery to one's muscles, which is completely the opposite of what one wants to be doing before they go and get in the boxing ring. So there's lots of examples out there of like completely inappropriate styles of breath work being practiced at different times, but probably get a lot of likes and comments on Instagram because of how they look and the way in which they're perceived.
Yeah, I wonder what Patrick McEwen would say about that and the oxygen advantage. But I'm sure he would say, yeah, you should be nasal breathing and slowing the breathing down. And we will be having Gray Cause on the podcast, who's one of the lead trainers for the oxygen advantage. And him and I are going to be leading a retreat out in Girona, Spain in September. So if you want to learn more about oxygen advantage, stay tuned for that episode. But yeah, I guess in defense of Aubrey Marcus, I'm not his biggest fan, but I do know.
For those of you who don't know, who is Aubrey Marcus? I think it might be useful to cover that off.
I don't know. I guess he's sort of the king of spiritual woo BS, maybe the king of that, and then Jake Paul is sort of the king of.
I know who Jake Paul. I think people will know who Jake Paul is. Yeah, boxer, YouTuber turned boxer, but Aubrey Marcus. Yeah, I wasn't aware of who that is.
Yeah, very into archetypes. Lives in Austin. Former MMA fighter, son of a rich oil magnate. Made himself successful in his own way.
Is he the son of a former MMA fighter?
No, he is a former MMA fighter. He's the son of an oil magnate.
Is he a former MMA fighter? Isn't that Carl Kingsbury?
No, I think they both. No, they definitely did. Really? He definitely did have some fights. I don't know if he was successful or not. I remember him talking about when he was at an ayahuasca retreat and some guy went mental and he had to go and use his MMA skills to wrestle him to the ground effectively. But yeah, in his defense, I know that the Wim Hof method is great for psyching you up for things like ice baths. That's normally how they do it in Wim Hof. You do Wim Hof breath, you get psyched up and you go and do something really difficult like an ice bath. And I imagine a fight is also similarly nerve-wracking, and maybe you do need a bit of hyping up to get in the right state of mind to win a fight.
Yeah, but also the point of that style of breath work, or the Wim Hof style of breath work before getting an ice bath, is also to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in your body, so to turn off your receptors for pain, which makes it easier for you to get on an ice. And I, at least maybe being slightly biased, having done Patrick McKeown's training in Oxygen Advantage, I wouldn't want to be depleting myself of carbon dioxide before a fight. But it would be interesting to know whether Aubrey Marcus has any knowledge of what we're talking about.
I'm looking him up as soon as we finished here. I'm looking him up.
Yeah.
What is the? Because I think, if I've spoken to quite a few people about breath work, bearing in mind I'm doing this with Rich and so he's a breath worker, and I've been interested in like almost word association. So I say, breath work. What do people think of? And Wim Hof obviously comes up time and time again. And obviously, I think the Instagram. He's got a great Instagram with going to all these sorts of insane situations of freezing cold waterfalls and stuff. And then I think he got a program in the UK where he took a load of celebrities through kind of some of that training. What is that? What is that? Anything to do with what either of you do, or is that kind of a third strand of breathwork, if you like?
Well, it's definitely the opposite of what I do. In that Wim Hof is this sort of very intense style of breath work that I'm not sure what he would even say in relation to what the purpose specifically of the breath work is, at least in isolation. From my point of view, if people find benefit from practicing that style of breath work, which is effectively 3 rounds of hyperventilation, so I think you take 30 breaths in and out through the mouth 3 times, which on a physiological level creates a pretty strong stress response in one's body, as you're effectively putting your nervous system into a state of sympathetic hyperarousal. If someone benefits from that style of breath work and it feels good to them, fine. My issue with the Wim Hof method, and specifically what I'm talking about is the style of breath work within the Wim Hof method rather than the ice, is that they don't teach it through a lens of one's neurobiology or specifically one's nervous system. It's just taught us in like, just breathe. And for some people, it may be appropriate to engage in a very activating and mobilizing style of breath work. But for a lot of people out there who are experiencing any form of emotional dysregulation, that will be too much for their system and can put them into more dysregulated states than they already find themselves in. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There are definitely times of people's life where more stress is not needed. We talk about voluntary hyperventilation and intermittent hypoxia, aka breath holds. That is a type of hormetic stress. So it's the same as ice and sauna and exercise. They're all hormetic stresses. We stress the body and the body rebounds with an overcompensation of muscle building in the case of exercise. And with ice, it's cold shock proteins and norepinephrine and dopamine. And yeah, with intermittent hypoxia, if you get your blood oxygen down low enough, you can get things like stem cell production and P53, which helps with DNA folding and anti-cancer. So there are definitely a lot of benefits, but not everyone can benefit from those things, especially if they're in a state of nervous system complete dysregulation and their system is completely shut down and they don't have the capacity to overcompensate. They don't have the capacity to rebound. It can just kind of kick them when they're already down. And yeah, what I've heard about Wim Hof is I've done Wim Hof. We've met him. He's a great guy. He's helped so many people. I mean, that's what you can't really argue with, is like so many people have said, this cured my depression. This cured my anxiety. And there are other people who said, I found it, I experienced flooding, which is basically when you get too much, emotions and you can't regulate. Other people have said, it re-traumatized me and things like that. Definitely, there are people who will have suffered from that type of extreme breath work. And also, there are diminishing returns with these things as well. There are people who've said, I became a Wim Hof instructor, and at first I managed to get my breath holds up to like 3 minutes, and then I kept on doing it every day for 2 years, and by the end I could only hold my breath for 30 seconds. So knowing about Patrick McKeown's work, we would say that yes, you've messed up your chemoreceptors for oxygen and carbon dioxide, and you need to balance that out with some Patrick McKeown style, light, slow and deep breaths. And I say the same thing about conscious connected breath work. In my study, we did 40 minutes of conscious connected breathing and 10 minutes per day. Some people said, can I do more? And I said, yes, but only if you do some oxygen advantage based breath retention or breath work that will offset all that over breathing.
And so what is the link between cold water submersion and the breath, and what is happening there in terms of people's ability to stay in cold water because of breathing a certain way? Because I don't know if it's just my perception, but maybe over lockdown in this country, I would say the number of people doing some form of breath work and cold water submersion went up exponentially. I'm not sure why that is, but what is the link between the two?
Definitely the amount of people filming themselves getting into ice
Well,
baths
yeah,
too.
that's true. Yeah, it could have just been for
Yeah.
effect. It could have just been for the gram, but yeah.
One of the side effects of ice baths is Instagram. You have to upload it. It's a shame. But so I think breathwork's been used for pain reduction for many years. There's Lamaze breathing, which people use or when they're giving birth. It helps them deal with the pain of giving birth. And I think that voluntary hyperventilation, or I know that voluntary hyperventilation creates a catecholamine response, like release of dopamine, norepinephrine, and other kind of pain-killing, soothing things that makes it easier to go and take on the pain of an ice bath.
James, you mentioned earlier, I'm very interested basically in shortcuts. I'll be honest, because I'm not claiming to be sort of CEO standard of importance, but obviously working professional in central London. You mentioned your app, which really interests me because I think there are lots of apps that people are probably aware of in the meditation space, but maybe not as many in the breathwork space. I wonder if you could talk us through what that's about. I think you said you mentioned you launched it last year.
Yeah, last year. So I guess maybe worth touching on is I definitely feel like I've moved into a place of not being massively supportive of shortcuts. I think when I first got into breathwork, and specifically that style of breathwork we've spoken a bit to in relation to conscious connected breathing, I wanted quick fixes, I wanted shortcuts, I wanted to resolve all of my stuff as quickly as possible. I've just started working with a Jungian psychologist who, in my intro call with her, told me not to expect any changes at all until potentially experiencing some subtle shifts after 6 months of weekly sessions. And I think I've more moved into a place of actually, if one does want to create lasting and real shifts in their emotional state and their way of being in the world, that takes time. And I think part of my issue with the world of conscious connected breathing is if you take the modality out of it, the narrative that tends to be around it is that you can resolve all of your stuff really quickly with just a few rounds of conscious connected breathing and just a few rounds of hyperventilation. And I personally I think that one probably can, or Richard's study will speak to it in relation to people can experience improvements in their emotional state. But I think for most people to experience sort of big, profound, lasting emotional change, that does require deeper and more comprehensive work over a long period of time. The quote that used to get banded around within the world of conscious connected breathing, which sort of just makes me throw up in my mouth every time I bring it to mind, and I think Alan used to mention it, but I don't want to dirty his name with it, is one session of conscious connected breathing is equivalent to 2 years of therapy. And first of all, it's just completely incomparable in relation to their therapeutic application from my point of view. But also, like, upon what is that founded? Anyhow, what I'm sort of badly trying to say in this in relation to the app is that the way that the app is designed and the breathwork sessions on there, they are designed to create a shift in your emotional state and move you into a more relaxed and settled place. But I always say to anyone who's going to engage in any form of any modality or any practice is to see if you can diligently stay with that practice over a period of time and experience the long-lasting benefits of it by sticking to it in a slow and steady way.
Yeah, I think that psychotherapy has a problem. I did study psychotherapy, postgraduate certificate, and I chose to leave and do research on my PhD in conscious connected breathing because I discovered, psychotherapy's results, certainly CBT, are pretty poor. It only has a response rate of 40% that's CBT. only 40% of people respond to CBT. And of those people, most of them relapse. I think it's like 80% relapse after eight sessions of CBT. And I do think this is another problem of mental health services. They're just not quite good enough at the moment. They need to be improved. And that's why I think we are doing all this research on psychedelics and on breathwork, because they do seem to have results. And yes, there is that saying, I think maybe it was Jung, but beware of unearned wisdom. I think certainly there are people who are abusing psychedelics and abusing conscious connected breathwork to take shortcuts. But there are other people who just need one session of psychedelics and that heals their treatment resistant depression. That's what we found in the research. I think psychotherapy is decent, but there are better things coming along. And I think that's good news.
I think it's dangerous to say that there are better things coming along. I think for me, there's something important in relation to like things not having to be binary in relation to like it's psychotherapy or it's breathwork and psychedelics. It's like, can we not live in a world where psychotherapy can be really, really supportive in relation to things like interpersonal relationships and learning how to co-regulate with another human when someone hasn't had a healthy development? And then psychedelics and things like conscious connected breathing can be really supportive on another level in relation to potentially things like hypotransient frontality and bringing up and processing emotional charge that otherwise is difficult to access through a psychotherapeutic intervention.
I don't think it's good enough. Like, I don't think psychotherapy is good enough. Like, it doesn't meet my standards. It doesn't meet the standards of other treatments, of other medicines. And I do think that psychotherapy is going to struggle with things like AI coming along, undercutting everyone, because to see a psychotherapist for 50 minutes, in London, it's about £100. In San Francisco, it's about $200. And the vast majority of people cannot afford that. And they don't have the time. They don't have time for 2 years of psychotherapy. And hence why, I do think we need better things.
And do you think you can resolve things like interpersonal complex traumas just through things like breathwork?
Yes, I mean, there is research to show that, yes, exactly that. DeWalt and Maurice Cruz showed exactly you can treat. He's treated 8 firefighters in Brazil with PTSD with just 6 sessions of conscious connected breathing.
Sure, but PTSD is different from complex trauma. And I think this is maybe where we'll differ in our viewpoints, is that I do think things like conscious connected breathing and TRE and those sort of like more acute therapeutic practices can be really helpful for people who are experiencing PTSD, as the study you just mentioned has referenced. But complex trauma is very different from PTSD. And most people in the Western world are experiencing complex trauma rather than PTSD. So I don't know if it's helpful to lay out the difference between complex trauma and PTSD, but PTSD would be described as like more acute shock trauma, whereas complex trauma is developmental trauma. So things like neglect in childhood, or I don't know, for me being sent to boarding school very young and experiencing a lot of homesickness. That's a very different thing to the example you've just described in relation to firefighters. And for me, as much as maybe the studies that you've read and referenced don't allude to psychotherapy being as helpful as others might make out, or as helpful as widespread as it is, there is something important, at least in my personal experience, in relation to having that interpersonal relationship and learning things like co-regulation and building back agency into one's sense of self, that I think is very difficult to do without someone else there supporting one in that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, complex PTSD is very different from shock trauma and PTSD. And maybe that's the thing, as we do more research, we discover, okay, 8 sessions of conscious connected breathing, you've been in a fire, you've had a car crash, that's exactly what you need. You've been to boarding school, you've got complex PTSD, you had an alcoholic parent, you go to psychotherapy and things like that. I think, there's going to be many different treatments for different symptoms and etiologies.
Yeah,
I think going back to my, I suppose, challenge to you both is if I can't get hold of a psychotherapist, what chance have I got of getting hold of a experienced breathwork professional? So I suppose, is it in your in your goals, in your aims to sort of get this to a wider audience, and to get this sort of more mainstream. I mean, I don't know if anything is on offer in the UK for free in terms of NHS, anything to do with breath whatsoever. So is that in the forefront of your minds as well? Because I can't access a psychotherapist, say, I've got less chance of accessing an experienced breath worker, even if I knew. I mean, I happen to know a couple, but a lot of people probably wouldn't, or would go for the targeted ads and find themselves in a mess. So is that something in the forefront of your mind?
100%. It is written exactly in my PhD proposal and dissertation. Hopefully this paper is taken note by policymakers on the NHS and insurers in the US. Yeah, 100%. One of the reasons I did this was to get it into the hands of everyone who needs it for free in countries that have national health services. And yeah, and James's stuff is available worldwide. It's online. Yes, you have to pay a fee, but I think it's a pretty reasonable fee compared to a psychotherapy session, which is pretty expensive.
Yeah, James, could you talk a bit more to that in terms of how to access your wealth of knowledge, your app, all that kind of stuff? Where do people find you? All that useful stuff.
Yeah, it's really kind. So the app is called Breathe with James. It's available on the App Store and Google Play. And then most of my stuff is sort of, I guess, comes through Instagram in relation to sort of best place to connect with me. And I'm pretty good on questions and that sort of thing if anyone wants to reach out and ask anything.
Amazing.
Great. All right. Well, what's next for you, James? What's coming up in the pipeline?
Well, I quite like to sit around a dinner table with you, Natalia, and hear you slag off psychotherapy while she's training in it.
We do slag off psychotherapy. It's definitely got problems. Yeah. Yeah, the reason he says that is because my wife, Natalia, is in the midst of a master's in psychotherapy right now.
Yeah.
She hasn't been put off it completely yet. She's still holding steady.
No, because what her plan is, exactly what you've said, James, is like we need breath workers who can hold space. She is planning to use breathwork and psychotherapy so that she can do breathwork with people and then help them integrate. And that's what I do. That's why I have my working with people training, my holistic counseling training, my postgraduate certificate in psychotherapy. I'm not a psychotherapist, but I have 2 years of training to hold space for people when they are doing that breath work. So yeah.
Maybe we don't have time for this, but I'd be really interested. If you have the time to look into the modalities of therapy, like organic intelligence, somatic experiencing, and NARM, which have that sort of more that focus on one's neurobiology and also work on a similar level to how conscious connected breathing work in relation to being more body focused, rather than the sort of like traditional psychodynamic therapies, and how that might differ.
Yeah, actually, somatic experiencing is one of the theoretical frameworks I if people want to read that, wait until it's published. If people want me to talk more about that, I'm happy to talk about that in a future episode. Yeah. We do want listeners to send us messages with topics and questions that we can answer. So please DM me, slide in, email me, email Andy, and we'd love to take questions.
For sure. Well, in the interest of giving something back to you two, I've actually done a bit of research on myself. Have either of you heard of the taco breath?
No.
Sounds delicious.
Well, genuine article I found online. It's my wellness tip of the week. The taco breath is one of few breaths that we teach where you inhale through your mouth and you actually have to curl your tongue and inhale through your tongue like it's a straw. It's really good for physically cooling down the body and mentally cooling you down. You have to sit with your back, neck, and head aligned, feet flat on the ground, and inhale through your tongue like it's a straw. Then you swallow the breath while you're holding on to the breath, and then you exhale through your nose, pulling your belly button to your spine. A long, slow, deep breath. It smooths any stomach aches, and it's good for arthritis.
There you go. Wow, any stomach ache.
The taco breath.
Maybe
you're welcome.
Maybe you could train as a breath worker, and that can be your thing, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the taco breath guy. I actually had to go back to 2015 So maybe breathwork has evolved a little bit since then.
I'm sure you could create a big Instagram following with the Taco Breath Guys, your Instagram handle.
I do need a cooler one, as discussed last week. My name is just my Instagram handle. So I tried the Wellness Wanderer, but maybe I'll now be Taco Breath.
Probably do very well.
Yeah, I mean, you could just, we could just certify you right now as breath worker. James, should we start a breathwork school and certify Andy?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just over
Congratulations.
weekends.
Well done.
This takes a weekend to be
No,
a
it
taco
doesn't.
breather.
It doesn't even take a weekend.
Just
You've done it. You've done it. And that's how easy it is to become a breath worker, which is a big problem.
All that remains to say is thank you so much, James, for joining us. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I've learned a lot. Please do remember to like and subscribe and find us at all the usual social media and good podcast places and bad podcast places. Any closing comments from you, Rich, James?
Yeah. I'll just say find James at Breathe with James on Instagram, breathewithjames.com. Is that right?
You
the
got
website?
it. You got it. You got it.
And I'm at the Breath Geek on Instagram and thebreathgeek.com. We are on all good podcast places now. So like, subscribe, write us a review. And if you don't want to give us 5 stars, write us an email as to why you don't want to give us 5 stars, and we'll try and improve.
But don't write a bad review.
Exactly. Don't do that. No. Write it to me personally, and I'll fix it. Basically, I promise. All right, here we go.
Well, thanks
James.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and lovely chatting to you both.
Absolutely.
You got a little bit of outro.
Yeah. All right, everyone.